Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to have Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell here with me, and we'll be sharing, and she'll be sharing with you some really interesting research on the nature of on telepathy and the possible origins of consciousness. Just a little brief bio on her. Diane Hennacy Powell is an award-winning clinician and international recognized expert on autism and savant syndrome. She's an independent researcher with a private neuropsychiatry practice in Medford, Oregon. Dr. Powell graduated summa cum laude from Ohio State University, where she trained in neuroscience. She was granted a full scholarship at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where she stayed for her residency training in psychiatry. She was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School before her postdoctoral fellowship in the genetics of inborn metabolism at the University of California. Dr. Powell came to the conclusion that our model in neuroscience is not only incomplete, it is based on false assumptions. She became the director of research for the John E. Mack Institute in 2005 and was the project director for the annual Transformation of Consciousness report for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which resulted in the widely acclaimed 2007 Shift report. She has contributed chapters to 5 academic books, including the latest edition of the Oxford University Handbook on Psychology and Spirituality, currently in press. It was the first volume of the new scientific academy, the Academy for Advances in Post-Materialist Sciences. Her 2008 book, the ESP Enigma, received an award from the LA Festival of Books and has been translated into German, Portuguese, and Finnish. Dr. Powell has presented her research on autistic children at scientific conferences in the US and abroad, and appeared in numerous podcasts and radio and television shows, including Dr. Phil. She's the founding member of the Academy for Advances in Post-Materialist Sciences and has been an invited member of multiple scientific think tanks, including the La Jolla Group for Understanding the Origin of Humans. She's also served on the board of the Gene Houston Foundation, the Parapsychological Association, and the Forever Family Foundation. She's got multiple projects, which hopefully she will go into today, including the Telepathy Project, the PTSD Project, Center for Excellence, Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies. Welcome, Dr. Powell.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So one thing that struck me about your background is that you're treading on an area which a lot of people in the scientific community, especially doctors, don't often do, and yet, in my opinion, I think a lot of opinion of a lot of people, is a very important area of research. If you can please share with the audience what your journey. And give us the cliff notes on that.
Well, I come from a scientific family. My father was the head of the artificial heart program at Battelle Memorial Institute, and he had a graduate degree in marine biology and in genetics. And so ever since I was a small child, I have been groomed to be a scientist. And my father was very much like Einstein. And having grown up with Einstein as a model for how to advance science, I realized that you have to take on the controversial subjects. I mean, every scientist who's really trying to push us into a new understanding has to walk that walk.
Right. That's very true. Your journey, because I have here the book, which I recommend everybody read, is probably one of the sharpest and clear descriptions of the challenges of doing ESP, but also the possibilities that exist within us. You've actually quoted, and this is from you, is Whether telepathy exists is one of the most important questions for us to answer. If anyone could prove telepathy, I predict that it would be non-vocal autistic children with savant skills.
Mm-hmm.
Can you please share and how did you arrive at this conclusion?
Well, as someone who's been trained to be a neuropsychiatrist, what I do is I think about the connection between someone's inner world and their behavior. I'm trying and differences in their brains. And so that's really what my specialty is. And knowing what I know about the brain, autistic children are the ideal candidates. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the skills they have, that the savant skills are usually right hemisphere skills. And if you look at their deficits, they are left hemisphere deficits. And that reversal in dominance is what is associated from my work and others with increased psychic abilities. And because in our normal waking state, our left hemisphere is more dominant over the right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is really more associated with linear thinking and logical thinking, whereas the right hemisphere is more associated with intuitive and sort of gestalt, or, kind of more holistic thinking. And if you look at the phenomena itself of ESP, things like telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, or sometimes called remote viewing, what you're seeing is someone who's able to access information in a way that is not the usual experience for people. And the population that I know of that can do that in spades are the autistic savants. If you look at the case histories of them, they have skills such as being able to give out several digit prime numbers without being able to do math, that the numbers just appear to them. And then it turns out that there actually are case reports going way back of these children who, if they had had a diagnosis of autistic savant back then, that's what they would have been labeled. And so having gone back into the old literature when people would just write a description of how somebody presented, such as back in the 1800s, there was this little boy who hadn't ever gone to school. He didn't even know how to do math or read. He was only 6 years old, and all of a sudden he started saying all of these mathematical formulas just out of the blue. I mean, and really complex formulas, and yet he had no background in math, and it's almost like he's channeling some kind of mathematician, or he's somehow accessing that information. So that's in a nutshell the reasons why I initially chose the population. And then I have other reasons as well. And one of them is that their sensory system is exquisitely finely tuned and accurate compared to ours in many of the savant skills. So perfect pitch, which is your ability to really differentiate between different frequencies of sound, is found in a high percentage of people who are autistic compared to the general population. The way that they process sound is also different in that you can have two notes that are farther apart from one another that are perceived by the autistic person as happening simultaneously. So it's as though their brains are operating at a much faster processing speed than the rest of us. That's one way to interpret that. Their ability to find Waldo in a very complex picture and to just immediately go right for it without having to scan it is an example of their gestalt kind of thinking. So all of these things, and then And then you add on top of that, how would someone behave if they were that highly sensitive and psychic? Well, they would not be interacting with other people like normal people, because they would not understand other people's behavior, because their perception of the world is so different. And lo and behold, one of the major criteria for diagnosing people with autism is that they're kind of in their own world, and they seem to be perfectly content to be doing something by themselves, and don't they don't have something called a theory of mind. And what a theory of mind is the recognition that someone else doesn't necessarily know everything that you know. And so a typical way to test for that is to take an object and to hide it behind something while somebody is out of the room, and then and ask the child, when they come back, do you think that they're going to know where it is? And children under the age of 4, although there's a range there, but in general, a lot of children under the age of 4 will assume that the person who walked out of the room is going to know that you hid the toy behind the pillow, because they have this sense of us as being all kind of omniscient. And but then that goes away. Well, autistic children never lose that. And it's like, well, isn't that interesting that they somehow think we're all omniscient? And makes you wonder, well, maybe they have a little of that, especially with all of the autistic skills that they demonstrate.
I guess for a lot of people, a lot of the lay people, their first exposure to seeing in a dramatic context was the movie that came out back in the 80s with Tom Cruise and the Rain Man. Which was, because up until then, even the term savant was actually, this is an abbreviated version of something a little bit more pejorative at that time. The idiot savant, which then, of course, people realized there's nothing idiotic about him. There's this very special, gifted children. And in the 80s, I remember a lot of people finally came to some awareness what a savant means and what they can do. And I think that over the years, we've seen an evolution in understanding, and yet many people still regard children of this as anomalies, as something that not to be really studied as much as you are or other people are doing. And one thing I want to agree with you is studying anomalies is one way to change the paradigm, such as back in the early 1900s, there were anomalies in physics. And eventually that led to the development of both quantum theory and relativity, specifically with Einstein's special. So I see that definitely in the work, in your work with savants, I think we're seeing an anomaly which eventually will force us to reconsider our paradigm, or this model which you refer to as incomplete. Now, I actually have a little clip. The book that you have here, which I want everybody, please buy this book. It's a great book. It's actually kind of, you've continued to add chapters and research to your project since 2008. And I believe there is one young girl, maybe her name is Haley, is that you were very impressed with, and she stood even head and shoulders above the other savants as possible subject for the developing an evidence-based protocol that ESP or telepathy exists. What I'd like to do is I have here a little clip, and if you can please introduce the setting for Haley, and here a clip that I did from your. I don't think we can talk over it, but we can talk beforehand. Just give me 1 second here. This is okay. All right, it's cued in, and we can let's see here. Okay, me.
Video you're looking at shows the experimental setup we had last spring. Haley, a 10-year-old severely autistic child,
and her therapist are seated alone in the room, together at a table and separated by a tall partition that prevents eye-to-eye or physical contact. Cards with randomized numbers, words, sentences, pictures, and equations were hidden until the experiment. The therapist viewed them one by one on her side of the visual barrier and then asked Haley what she was thinking or looking at. Haley pointed with her wooden pencil inside characters on stencils with her right hand to select them, and then entered them with her left into a device that converts text to speech. You'll notice that there are no characters for division signs, equal signs, or decimal points, so the therapist had to tell Haley when these occurred. You'll also notice that her answer is 100% accurate on 18 out of 18 digits. This is just one of 10 equations that she did in a 10-minute period, with accuracy above 90% each time. This video shows Haley with the other therapist with whom she has reportedly had telepathic communication. In this experiment, the therapist was asked to write a description of the picture that she was looking at, and then to ask Haley what she was thinking. As you can see, Haley is selecting the letters, and the stencil has 26 letters, and she is just as accurate as she is with the numbers. The video you just saw was described as jaw-dropping by someone who attended the scientific conference where I presented it this summer. But I want to go back and I want to film Haley under ideal scientific conditions. There are also several other children across the globe who demonstrate a similar phenomenon. I want to go and document them as well. I need your help. This will be a time-consuming but very important and comprehensive documentary that has the potential to revolutionize science and society. Please help by participating. No gift is too small. And along the way, you'll get to explore with me. You'll get to experience the excitement of being part of science in the making. So please join us. Please support the Telepathy Project. Thank you.
Okay. So Haley, what you've mentioned that in her case, we have here a potential subject that under proper protocols could demonstrate or at some point show an evidence-based system where we can demonstrate the existence of some sort of higher skill, whether they call it telepathy or something. How much progress have you've seen other savants like Haley since then? That's correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's one that I heard in a previous talk, a Spanish boy, hyperlexic, you referred to, where can you just tell us a little bit about him? And
well, so Ramses was 5 years old when I met him, and he reportedly, by his mother's report, had started reading and writing several languages by the age of 2. And these include Arabic, Hebrew, Hindi, Japanese, Spanish, English, Russian. I mean, languages with very, very different alphabets and structures. And he was also reading science books. And that is something called hyperlexia, where children, for reasons not understood, are able to read at such an advanced level at a very young age. But in addition to that, the mother reported that he was telepathic. And I saw a video that she had posted on Facebook of him, where she had a whiteboard and she was drawing numbers, letters, And he was just spitting them out, and there was no way that he could see it. And I thought, gee, that is very similar to my research. And so I contacted her and did experiments with him. And some of those were filmed and went viral. They were Breitbart, I think it was Breitbart Studios did one of them, and then there was another time that a team from Germany came over and filmed an experiment I did with him. But I mean, this work has been much more available to people that are over in other countries, because there's just much more of an acceptance of it. But so he's somebody that a lot of people, when they contact me about my research, they're interested in Ramses. And one of the reasons why I did multiple studies with him was that he's verbal, he can speak. And so you are taking care of that variable of people who wonder when they see the video of Haley, they wonder, well, gee, how do I know that, the therapist isn't somehow, holding it differently so that she's choosing the letters differently? And that, I mean, I did 3 days worth of controlled experiments with her, with 2 different therapists, for a total of about 6 hours. And she was consistent, and I never saw any pattern of any kind that suggested there was anything going on with the stencils. That's funny. And in fact, I mean, I have someone who contacted this other parent of another child that I've worked with, who did a study that actually shows that these children who use that methodology of communicating in the autistic community, there's always been this question of, how do we know that it's not just wishful thinking on the part of the parent or the teacher that's working with the child, that that they're really able to communicate, and it's been shown that they're the ones choosing the letter. And that was in pretty much real time, that clip that you saw. And so you just see how she just goes right for it. And she could also independently type on an iPad, and that's something that's harder for people visually to see. Right. When you're trying to film it for experimental video. And so what I did was I had a total I had cameras all around that room. I mean, there were 5 cameras. Everybody was mic'd. Everything was time stamped, clocks going, so that you could really know that this was not footage that anybody had manipulated to try to make it look like it was anything other than what it actually is.
So in the video which we just saw, the assistant, is she reading from these numbers from a special card that she's got next to her? And then
so what I did was I in all of my experiments I use randomized stimuli. So because you want to make sure it really is truly random if you're going to apply any kind of statistics to it. And so I used a random number generator and a random list generator and that sort of thing to take stimuli that I chose that I thought had some visual appeal, and that I could do various different experiments with. For example, some of the cards that I had the therapist look at had more than one thing that could have been said about them. Because the therapist would just say, Haley, what am I thinking, or what am I looking at? And I remember there was a card that had a picture of a cow with a little cartoon balloon above the head that said moo. And she spelled out moo instead of cow. and so it was interesting because it was really what the therapist was thinking. The therapist was actually reading the moo, and thinking more about that than the cow. And so it's interesting also to see when there are mistakes, and oftentimes it was because the therapist was actually holding two things simultaneously in her mind. And with Haley, I was also able to test her with two different therapists, both of whom had independently figured out that Haley was reading their mind, and were afraid to talk to the parents about it, and it had both independently ended up telling the parents. And so the parents were the ones who, after seeing this, they were so excited about it, they contacted me, and they knew that it would be really significant for science. And so they agreed for me to come and do the testing.
Now, this took place a few years ago, right? 2015 or 20?
Yes, this was several years ago. And so
have you stayed in touch with the family and just find out what if her powers diminished or her skills, or is the same, or with Haley regarding that since the last time you met up with her?
I haven't been in touch with them recently. I mean, the last time I was in touch with them, she was still engaged in those kinds of activities and was still just as psychic. But things were a little bit disruptive, and it disrupted the research because the family adopted another child from their home country, and any change for an autistic child just throws them, for a loop. And so I just thought, that they really had already helped me in terms of letting me come and do the experiments with their child. And I thought that, that their priority really needed to be the family. And they really wanted Haley to have a younger sister, because her older sister was going off to college, and they were more concerned about her having the socialization and having the companionship, and they had their hands full with all of that. And so, and in the meantime, I had other parents contacting me, telling me that there were children who had different abilities, and I also tested this little boy named Akil, and he was somebody who was able to type independently, and I was able to film that, and it's just incredibly impressive, and that was something that I informed Deepak Chopra about, and he and his chief scientist from his foundation came and witnessed some experiments, and it blew Deepak away so much that he actually left his jacket and his briefcase in his wallet.
Was this in what country is Akil from?
Akil's family is originally from India.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And of course, people in India believe in these phenomena, and they, like Haley's his parents really understand how important it is for people to shift their paradigm in terms of what they think, first of all, what they think these children are capable of, because so many people do have this misconception that they're not very bright. And the reality is that autism has no association with IQ. In fact, many of these children are very, very gifted, and I think that they really have so much to offer us, and we really should be finding ways to help them more get what they need.
With Ramses, I'm really curious because you mentioned earlier that he can speak. So usually the standard model has been, well, if the left brain is knocked out and you only have the right brain, there is when in his case, it seems to almost challenge this idea that language skills reside primarily in the left brain. Or is that a possibility, or is it his way of accessing language, maybe non-analytical, non-language based, maybe through some other way of bringing that information into his system?
Well, there's several things I want to say to that. One is, first of all, this notion that language is in the left hemisphere is true only to a point. We know that there's more lateralization, meaning representation of language in both hemispheres in in female than in male in general. Also, if in a gay man, there's more lateralization of language. And then true also more lateralization for people who are left-handed and who start playing music at an early age. And then there's also some people who are left-handed who have language in the right hemisphere rather than the left hemisphere.
Okay. So it's a little bit more complicated than the vernacular way of interpreting. Okay, got it.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that a lot of people have this idea that autism, that the disruption in language in autism is the kind of disruption you see in Haley and in Nikhil, which is that they really have a problem with the expression of language. And they can comprehend language, but they can't express it. And it's really more of if you look at their brain and you see which area of their brain is involved, it's really more of a difficulty with coordinating the motor skills that it takes than it is about that they have a difficulty with the words themselves in a way that there's these different types of aphasia is the point I'm making. And so I find that in autism that the ones who have the regressive autism, where they were developing normally, and then all of a sudden right at the time when language is starting to develop, something happens to them, and it disrupts that language development. And oftentimes those ones are the most telepathic, which I find very interesting. It's as though the development of language in the normal sense, it disrupts that. And we can talk about that. I mean, I've got different thoughts about why that is. But the other thing to know is that in autism, the children that don't have the regressive form, what you see is that they have difficulty sometimes with comprehending language. They sometimes have difficulty with something called echolalia, where they'll repeat back to you what you say to them. So it's an aberration where it's like they don't really understand that language is about trying to communicate something. And then other children like Ramsey's, his ability to read is astounding. I mean, he took a year of college physics when he was 9 years old. That was something I helped to arrange for him. And so, I mean, he's extremely bright and gifted that way, but you cannot sit down and have a conversation with him. He doesn't really know how to use language conversationally. And so that's really, it's the aberration in language. It's not one particular type of aberration.
Are there any neurological correlates that associated with these specific in areas of the brain that are more affected by and that lead to these the development of these skills?
Well, I mean, one of the things that they've noticed with people who have the hyperlexia, which Ramsey has, is that they have some they have differences in the area of the brain that's also used for facial recognition. Mm. And so it's really there's like these little pieces like that, but it's in terms of having a complete understanding of it, we don't really quite have that yet. But it's as though they're using that ability to analyze patterns that you would normally use for distinguishing people's faces, that they're instead of using that for faces, which they oftentimes have a hard time looking at people in the eyes. So they're using it to recognize clusters of words. And so they oftentimes acquire language in chunks rather than a painstaking sort of, like we oftentimes do, learning how to, read and spell phonetically and whatnot. They're just like grabbing, whole chunks of words. And so, as I said, it's their processing speed seems to be significantly faster.
You mentioned earlier, a few minutes earlier, that the development of a language may have actually put some blinkers on our ability to see a larger field. Can you please elaborate? It sounds really, very interesting. You might also explain the cave paintings and all these things that have been coming up all over the world.
Well, one of the things that's very interesting is that there is this one autistic savant who's an artistic savant, and they when they looked at her art, her art's very similar to the kind of the cave art, and they really conjectured that it's as though she's kind of living in that more kind of visionary quest kind of world while in waking consciousn's. The fact that the telepathy goes away with the development of language is a really intriguing one, because I really think that telepathy is part of how children acquire language so easily. Because if you really think about what a complex task learning to speak is, and learning to understand what people are saying to you, I've had that experience from, I've studied various foreign languages, and when you first do that, I mean, you have to develop an ear for it, and just to hear all of these sounds and to really put that together into anything meaningful is really extraordinary. And the fact that children do it so rapidly and know what it is that the person is even referring to, and that is just remarkable. And so I raised the possibility that what if we're all telepathic in that first year or two of life, and then when we acquire language, we start using that as a short circuit communication style rather than trying to use this other means. And I think that what's also happened is that potentially you're, whenever you're learning some new skill, you're rewiring your brain. Right. And so you've got this kind of default mechanism that stays put because you didn't rewire over it.
So if you don't use it, you lose it, basically.
Yes.
What hope is there for people like who want to develop, perhaps to develop their language skills now? They want to be able to access some ways for developing telepathy, or whatever term you want to call it. How will you go about it at this stage as someone who's never really done that before? Are there specific protocols? For instance, the remote viewing protocols that were developed in the early 70s have been, to some degree, they seem to work depending on the person to some degree or another, but they're clearly nowhere near foolproof or anything of that nature. So is there something comparable that you have been thinking about, that we could, what I refer to as actionable intelligence, that people can say, okay, I want to have real proof. What can I do? Perhaps meditation, visualization. What do you recommend that people can access or do to perhaps become more sensitive to these other skills?
Well, there's several things that people can do. Meditation is really an excellent means. And one of the reasons why is that when you close your eyes, even if you don't know how to meditate yet, just closing your eyes will put you into alpha. And it's when we're in that frequency that we are most where evidence shows that that's when we are the most receptive. And there are ways in which you can try to fine tune that so that you're at 8 hertz, which is the frequency that appears to be the most associated with sort of receiving information. And so if you can use something, there's technologies where you deliver a different tone to each ear,
Right.
and you and then you get this you create this frequency that's really related to the difference between the two frequencies.
And that's interesting. Yeah.
And so if you go ahead. I mean, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just thought of the Schumann frequency, the Earth's, which seems to be very close to the frequency you mentioned.
That's right. That's exactly right. So that's what's interesting is that so you have the Schumann frequency, which is the Earth's magnetic field, and then you also have the fact that 8 hertz is the resonant frequency of water, and we are predominantly water.
That's amazing. You actually mentioned again in the book that we, and this is early, I'm sure your research has evolved from there, that we might have some sort of homing device in our mind, that the way homing device in our mind so that enables us to pick information that outside of normal 5 senses. And that, as you mentioned, the frequencies, there may be some correlate between being in that alpha state or that, and how pigeons, for instance, use the Earth's magnetic field to navigate. So there may be a kind of a carrier wave that's responsible for that.
Yes, exactly. And we really don't, most people don't really talk that much about, the electromagnetic properties of the brain. And because we live in such a pharmaceutically oriented time. But the EEG, which is used to measure brain waves, was invented by Hans Berger, who invented it because he thought it would help prove telepathy after he had an experience that many would consider telepathic, where a sister of his contacted him right after he had been in a near accident, and a very serious, potentially, accident. And she contacted him by telegram because she knew something that might be wrong. And so if you look at the EEGs of people, it's the closest association to states of consciousness that we have. It's the closest measure. I mean, there's nothing else that really has that correlation, and yet we tend to only discuss it as it relates to stages of sleep. Oh, these are the waves associated with slow, with deep sleep. These are the ones associated with dreaming sleep. These are the ones associated with waking state. But then they act as though that there isn't really much discussion about, well, what do we know about frequencies and states of consciousness when we're awake? And there's literature, some literature on that. But and that's a growing area that you really need to put more attention into, and into then channeling those frequencies, to sort of like making a better radio for ourselves in terms of what frequencies do you want to tune into.
And certainly I was doing some reading on some Tibetan lamas, and who are able to achieve greater control over their body or their heart rate or so on, or they talk about altered states of consciousness. And what they've seen is that the EEGs, sometimes these almost contradictory waves, like deep theta or delta waves, at the same time where you're having more waking consciousness, almost like they coexist at the same time in those people. That it sort of lends support to the idea that this kind of research definitely needs a lot more attention, much more than just, this is an EEG and this is a potential. So what are your moving forward in terms of your research? You have a and I don't think we have enough time here but you have a theory of the mind, basically a theory of how this may actually be maybe the cause of it, which you actually mentioned in your book. So it's almost like a Mobius strip, where at one point the mind is, and then it's. Can you just give us like the little cliff notes on that?
Sure. Well, the Mobius strip is something that I was aware of even as a small child, and I think it's a wonderful analogy of something that looks. So a Mobius strip is something that looks like it's a loop that has a twist in it, such that if you were to use a marker and mark along the inside of that loop, you'd end up eventually on the outside of the loop and then back on the inside. So it's like and so it looks kind of like it's something where there's an outside and an inside, but really they're one and the same. And I think that's a really good analogy for our sense that we have this idea that we have an inner world and that we have an outer world. And I think that that's a false dichotomy that we create. And I also think of the brain as the relationship to the consciousness that neuroscience has it backwards. I think that the brain enables us to navigate consciousness rather than it being what creates consciousness. And what we focus on is then what we're navigating. But so many people use the information predominantly that comes from their sensory system, that they're so focused, they're just focused, that keeps you focused in your immediate surroundings. And it keeps you focused, therefore, more on the kind of material local world as opposed to non-local information that other people, that's what they seem to want to focus on, like the savants who are there, just spontaneously speaking languages they weren't exposed to or spitting out mathematical equations.
Where do you think the cultural the differences? Because certainly in India and in some parts of Asia, these powers are almost taken as a given, or at least that can be developed. Whereas here in the West, we're so entrenched into this view that unless it's not measured right away, it just doesn't exist. Where do you think the origin of that? That could be the language, the way we're reading from right to left versus left to right. What do you think, in your opinion, is the cause of that bifurcation in cultures? That the West is this way and the East is this way.
Well, I think it's really in the West. After you had the split between science and spirituality, and education, church and the state, so and education, they stopped saying, that you could teach anything with spirituality or anything with religion. Then everything just became so focused on the secular and so focused on the material and focused on how do you profit from the material world. That's been what's been driving everything in terms of where we put our attention. Whereas you go to a place like India, and it's the exact opposite. I mean, the people there are much. I mean, sure, you have people that are extremely wealthy, but the majority of people are not, and yet they're reasonably happy people because they're free to pursue their spirituality, and that's what's the most important to them. And if you read the Vedas and whatnot, I mean, these kinds of abilities are called siddhis. They have a whole way of integrating this into their daily life because they never left being predominantly spiritual in their approach to life.
So you believe that there's a field, almost like that consciousness picks up the field, essentially, that there's a field outside there, and we are like radio transmitters or radio receivers, sorry, that pick up signals that the field's outside, or we are in it, but we're also outside of it. Is that the
way I would describe it? I think that cloud computing, I mean, the fact that we have all of this information in the cloud, and we can pick it up now with the device I can hold in my hand. Why can't our brain be just as, I mean, you know, what is it that has that we don't have? And and I've been looking at the components of the brain that at an intracellular level rather than at the macro level, because I think that the answers are really to be found in the in the micro level. I think that we are capable of quantum computation. That if you really look at what quantum mechanics says about how we co-participate in defining where everything is by measuring it, and we are just constantly measuring, and therefore we're constantly defining, and then we perceive things as being solid, that physics tells us is predominantly space. But what our brains do is they take all of this information and they create basically a virtual reality for us that we live in.
Right.
But then what we always come back to as a question, the big question is really who's observing that virtual reality?
Right. Yeah, it's amazing with the development of a lot of physics today. A lot of physicists today even refuse to incorporate the concept of consciousness. Even that is, they're not willing to fully embrace the implications of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is just a statistical approach, and they're still stuck in measuring specifics, and rather than looking beyond that and understanding there may be something else, the ghost in the machine sort of understanding. So in terms of, I understand where does your research take you now? I understand you have plans at some point for seeing, perhaps interviewing Ramses or some other savants. I mean, where is this take? Because we've only seen a little sliver of your research. It keeps evolving and getting more involved. But where do you see yourself this year and next year in terms of that, and how is that going to more works such as this great book?
Thank you. Well, I can't say too much right now, but I've been approached by some people who've been given a green light to do a documentary that's going to be on Netflix, and they're very interested in my research, and so we're really waiting for things to open up, because I do the research where the children are, and so so everybody's once everybody's able to travel again more easily and blah blah blah, then we're going to be doing some more experiments, and hopefully we'll be able to do some more things that I've been wanting to do, like doing QEEG, QEEG measurements of both the child and the parent during an experiment, so that we can actually see which parts of their brain are active during this process. And so I think that's really exciting, that my work is getting attention in a way that I think that it's at this point, I think it's inevitable that there's going to be something coming out. It's just a matter of so many different variables right now. But and then the other thing is that I'm continuing to work on theory.
Right.
Because I think that that's really one of the biggest hangups is that nobody else is really talking about how does the brain do this, and so I'm looking at the components of it that you can then say, oh, well, this is like a semiconductor, and this is, and if you really look at, you take the literature on each one of these different components and what it tells you the properties of it are, and then you explain that to somebody who's involved in computational science or physics, and they go, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. That makes sense. And I think that once that missing link, some of these missing links are there, and more and more people see the actual experiments for themselves, well documented, I think that the paradigm is really on the verge of shifting.
Well, I'm very, 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 very excited about this, because I do think that's where it's time for this left brain, or this particular paradigm, to be put to rest, to be challenged, and certainly cause a lot of trouble. The lack of balance, as the Taoists would say, that we would want to seek balance. Lastly, someone has been asked me in the chat room, are there any specific just like there's some thought that some medications might cause autism. Is there some medications or perhaps natural supplements that improve psychic abilities? Is that even been shown to exist?
Well, it's interesting that one of the things that one of the things that's been found is that a lot of people who are psychic have out-of-body experiences.
Okay.
And they achieve their psychic visions or whatever through that. And so there's a lot of literature about how to kind of bring on an out-of-body experience, which people also call astral projection. And there's certain, some people have that experience after they're given nitrous oxide, just going to have dental work done, or going to have, colonoscopy or something. Because that drug has this ability to cause people to have out-of-body experiences. Also, some people have future memory, which, I mean, that's really what Philip Dick had, this future memory, where it's like it's not that you, it's so similar to a memory, like going
Right.
back in time to remember, but you're going into the future instead. And that is something that fascinates me, and that's better understood from realizing that our concept of time is incorrect. That time may actually have 3 dimensions, just like space.
Right. And in fact, there are a couple of physicists that are even challenging that. Balfour, I believe, Julian Balfour, called The End of Time, and he talks about that time is our conception of time is not really. There are other models of that can perfectly explain reality without assuming that there is a past, present, and future. That is almost these old times exist simultaneously. Very much like when Philip K. Dick said that we actually are. He believes he exists in first century Rome, and it's that kind of impacted people, and to say the least, when he first talked about that in 1977. And sometimes I think Philip K. Dick represents a series of writers, like others like Whitley Strieber, for instance, who wrote, who's talked about the visitors, that although we can consider them all anomalous cases, I think when you bring them together, this is just something else that's going in our own consciousness and our own ability to admit that there's something else outside our existing paradigm. And this is where your research really is so brilliant and really called for, because I think, if I'm correct, the study of the savants is probably the most bulletproof way of really creating protocols for understanding the nature of consciousness. I mean, we can, even if we develop our abilities maybe we'll get it 1 out of 2 times in terms of, but let's say in the case of Haley or Ramsey's, there's something else going on that's definitely worth extensive research. And for that, I definitely commend you and congratulate you on your work and future work. Is there, where those who are interested in participating, sharing, contributing to your existing work, where can they see, where they can go and do that?
They can go to my website, Dr. Diane Hennacy .com.
Okay, I will include that in the link below after our broadcast. Well, Dr. Powell, it's been a pleasure. It's we definitely will have to come back because another big interest of mine is PTSD and how that current attempt is not really I don't think it's working very well. But in the meantime, this creates some real, very exciting possibilities for us. Thank you all. Thank you for sharing your time and your research, and we hope to see a lot more from you. Let us know. Keep us in the loop as to what if that documentary comes in. We'll all love to see it. We'll definitely, any way I can contribute or share with my audience, I'll be more than happy, because I do believe your research is really at the cusp of a new paradigm shift that we are experiencing bits and pieces, but we need a framework to really make it more palatable to the skeptic out there who is always thinking the model is the way to go. So thank you again for your time, and we'll speak with you real soon.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye. Well, folks, that brings us to another great talk with Dr. Powell, one of the true contributors in human consciousness. Those who are interested, please subscribe to our channel below. We're growing it leaps and bounds. We're growing and getting more people on board. And I will also include Dr. Powell's link to her website, where you can keep in touch with any developments that are taking place regarding her documentary, her work, her fundraiser, and much more. So again, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.